You are listening to From Embers, a weekly show on CFRC 101.9 FM about anarchist and anti-authoritarian ideas and practice. We are broadcasting from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples on land that has come to be called Kingston, Ontario, Canada because of the thievery and brutality of the Canadian state and its empire-loving parents. From Embers is about fires, some real and some metaphorical. Fires started generations ago and tended to over the years. Little sparks all across this territory that we hope will grow, spread, and engulf the thieving state called Canada and the capitalist system that has plagued this land since the fur trade.
Tonight we'll be talking about repression. When people act together to resist oppression and realize their desires for freedom and autonomy, those in power will inevitably try to crush that resistance and keep things just the way they were. But people have been resisting repression for about as long as they've been resisting, and we can learn a lot from hearing about what that looks like in different social and political contexts. In this first part of the show, we'll hear some stories from activists, anarchists, and Indigenous folks about their diverse experiences of repression, recorded at a community event in Kingston, Ontario.
I'm going to look at repression, especially through the lens of some prison farm organizing that happened in Kingston, mostly around 2010. And I'm sure tonight we will talk about many different kinds of repression, right? Repression encompasses a lot of different tactics that those in power try to use to break down our movements or to suppress our movements. Things like surveillance, especially conspicuous surveillance, infiltration, the legal system and selectively enforcing laws, prison, extra-legal violence, and I think even concessions, selective concessions or buying some groups off can be a form of repression. And those in power operate by divide and conquer, right? So they don't treat everyone the same way. They try to split our movements into fragments, into isolated groups that they can handle more easily. And in particular, they try to isolate militants and radicals. So, militants being people who want to fight back, who want to confront the wrongs going on in our society, and radicals, people from, the Latin, the roots, people who want to see root change, who want to see some things fundamentally change in society instead of just changing around the edges. And so if they can isolate the militants and the radicals, oftentimes they can keep things under control by intimidating other people or by placating them with promises. So if, as radicals, we want to succeed and want to be able to deal with repression, we have to break through that isolation, right? It's really important to build those bridges, because diverse movements can handle repression better, and not only that, they can actually help discourage repression from happening in the first place. And that's why I'd like to talk about the prison farms. So I know many of you were around in 2009, 2010, when that struggle was most active in Kingston. I know some of you were new, so I'll give a very brief summary. But in 2009, the Harper government decided to shut down the 6 prison farms. These were operating farms on prisons across Canada, because they felt that to have prisoners being able to go outside and work with animals, this wasn't punitive enough. They really wanted to punish people more and not have them go outside. And this was part of a shift to really a more American-style for-profit prison system. And a lot of people from different groups were upset about that. And a movement grew over many months, trying to get the government to reverse its decision. And the Harper government really stonewalled, and people decided to escalate, which was the correct decision, I think. Ultimately, that's where community power comes from either we escalate or we have the option to escalate, and those in power know that. So in the case of the prison farm, that meant civil disobedience, right? We knew that in order to shut down one of the major prison farms in Kingston, the government would have to remove a cattle herd there. And so this kind of became our point of leverage. It's very difficult to send a group of people to intervene directly in a prison from the outside, especially in a way that's not going to trigger lockdown and consequences for prisoners. And so the plan essentially was to create a blockade of any attempt to remove the cattle. And we promised this early on, so that the government would be forced to back down or to reconsider. And in some ways that it worked. It slowed down the process of the prison farm closures, and it kept them in the news. At the same time, we had to continue to build a movement, and especially to continue to build capacity for civil disobedience in Kingston. Mass law-breaking, mass action of that kind is not something that there has been a strong tradition of in Kingston. And so we did a bunch of different things to help to train people, to make people feel more comfortable in a confrontational environment, and to make them feel more able to handle whatever repression they might face, right? And over the course of the campaign, we would see that go all the way from conspicuous surveillance to very rough arrests and detention. So we held a number of civil disobedience trainings to help people kind of go through the process. What's it like to hold a blockade line? What's it like to get arrested? What should you do if you get arrested? To demystify that a bit for people, and to give them a process for handling that. We also set up a community on watch station, a COWS station, across from the prison, so a 24-hour surveillance station, essentially, where we would watch the prison and look for signs that they were about to remove the cattle. We had a phone tree in place so that we could call an instant blockade if they tried to bring in cattle trucks. And we also encouraged people to sign up in advance to do this. We had over 500 people sign up to be on this phone tree to carry out civil disobedience, which was really a huge response. And I think that came in part because we were able to kind of guide new people through this process to become more confident in taking this kind of action, even if they didn't have a history of doing that or weren't familiar with it. In the end, as many of you know, or maybe you've seen in the great documentary Till the Cows Come Home, there was a 2-day blockade of Collins Bay Institution that involved about 500 people blocking a roadway to try to keep these cattle trucks out. And over that 2-day period, 24 people were arrested, and also one donkey. And I think we definitely saw a shift in the kind of repression that was taking place. So in the beginning, we had kind of some practice blockades almost on previous days of different institutions, and the repression was limited to things like conspicuous videotaping or conspicuous photography of people who were blockading. On the first day of the blockade, it was local police officers who were arresting people and who felt maybe more constrained in terms of how rough they could be, how aggressive they could be, because they knew there are hundreds of people and who are actively there, thousands of people driving by and honking and supporting them. And then finally on the second day, on the final day of the blockade, they brought in busloads of OPP officers from out of town who were fresh out of, I think, the G20 protests in Toronto, who took a much more aggressive approach. It was a very different tone that day. That blockade did not hold for complicated reasons I'm not going to get into right now. But that movement did persist, and the federal government did recently commit to reopening the prison farms. So in some ways that campaign had a successful outcome. But I'm more interested in what we can learn about repression from that campaign. And I think especially the lessons are I think the first lesson is that powerful movements, when you build powerful movements that include a lot of people from a lot of different communities, those in power actually become afraid to be too aggressive. Instead of us being afraid of them, it's a little bit more balanced out. There really is a lot of safety in numbers when you're talking about repression. A second important lesson, though, is that even though numbers make everyone safer, not everyone is treated the same way, right? Not everyone is facing the same level of risk. We saw people who were supporters of the campaign who were former prisoners, who were maybe still on parole, be threatened with going back to jail in that campaign, and then some of them had to become, had to kind of withdraw or become less visible because of that. I think in that campaign we were actually a lot more powerful than we realized. I think that because of kind of a lack of experience with civil disobedience or with this kind of mass confrontational action, we as a movement were not as assertive as we could have been. I think we could have been a lot more assertive and could have been more persistent and more successful in that moment. And that's why resisting repression takes practice. It's not just something, you decide I'm going to get up and resist repression and there we go. It actually takes a lot of skills. It takes organizing time, like organizing this event, like supporting people who are in prison or who faced repression. And it also requires recruiting more people and bringing more communities in so that they understand what's going on.
So my repression is more of a personal experience, I guess. Well, it's also shared with other people, but it relates to kind of my own arrest, taking part in a blockade on Mohawk territory out in kind of the Tyendinaga area. And it was in 2014, I think, or was it 15, 14? Yeah, 2014, and it was, we were kind of out on the lines around a time where there was sort of a lot of agitation around like seeking an inquiry for all the murdered and missing Indigenous women, and also kind of just in general there was a lot of stuff going on even beforehand and kind of leading up to it with the kind of Idle No More stuff and everything. So there was quite a bit of a drive or mobilization across the country or the territory for people kind of standing up and showing their force and their numbers or whatnot. In any case, there was obviously the typical repression happening there with infiltrators, etc., people coming by pretending to be media but actually being cops. There was all the other surveillance, the spotlights on the camps and the blockades. So we were out on the roads blocking off Shannonville Gravel Road for about a week or so, and we had sort of both of the train lines within this occupied space. And then one day we went out in the morning and blocked off the CN rail line right on Wyman Side Road, and we tied off the tracks and put a fire up and hung out for a while. And then anyways, things started happening. There was surveillance vans that came by, and a little scuffle happened. There was a smashed out surveillance van, and cops all marching in. Eventually, people took a stand, stood their ground, and started getting picked off and arrested, and I was one of those people. That's not so much the interesting part of the story. The interesting part of the story happens later, which is sort of which relates to what typically happens when people face that, some kind of arrest or repression, is that there's the, they try to pull you off to interrogate you and get some kind of statement, which most of us refuse to do. You get stuck in jail. There's crappy food, if no food at all. And it's just stuff you have to kind of go through and deal with. That wasn't my first time actually arrested, and it's probably not going to be the last time. And for the most part, it's something that you just kind of have to grin and bear it for the first sort of 24 to 48 hours when you're in the police holding cell, and eventually then you get shipped off to something a little bit more bearable, which is like your county bucket or jail or whatever. And in there you actually have a chance to sort of have a shower, relax, interact with other people. But in that time period there, when you're kind of sitting down there, some of the things that happen outside are that people in your community or your friends in your circle try to kind of support you when you're inside the jail, and they go out and make sure that your canteen money's full. They you got a lawyer, they take care of you and stuff like that. But a lot of the times the focus can be drawn away from the reason you're in the jail in the first place, which is to stand on the lines and fight for something that you believe in. You know, a lot of the time it can be lawyers and court cases and all this stuff, and a lot of struggles can be sort of reduced to a battle in courts, which is, I think, what the police and what the state intends when they arrest you. And that's something that people shouldn't lose sight on, because one of the most significant moments for me when I was in jail was to be woken up one morning and out in the day room, and the guards come in and go, "Hey, your buddies are back on the tracks." And I had to laugh, because actually all the women of the territory in Tyendinaga went out and blocked the rail line while I was sitting in jail for doing the same damn thing a few days before. So for me, that's something that kind of made the whole time and all the repression and everything, the court costs and whatnot, sort of worthwhile, is to know that there are still people out there fighting. And of course there would be, because before I even showed up on the territory, people were fighting for the, kind of leads into the other point where, as much as the court cases and showing up and kind of sitting down on the little wood benches and kind of jumping through hoops is not really interesting, and I don't really believe myself that there is much victory that can be gained through court cases and battles like on their playing field, so to speak. There's still some interesting conversations or interesting kind of actions or even words that sometimes come out in the stances that people take. And one of them was when there's a few of us standing trial, and the judge was asking how we were going to plead. And all of the Mohawks they elected to not make a plea because it's not their law, and it's an occupying force. But then the judge was sort of perplexed because, hey, like, I was the only non-native, like, little white guy or whatever hanging out there facing the charges, and I chose not to enter a plea either. And I mean, aside from the fact that I'm like an anarchist and I believe in pleading to innocence or guilt, the main statement I made, which I thought was kind of common sense, was that, hey, I was arrested on someone else's land. Like, where's your jurisdiction and your authority over that territory, over that space? Like, you're an invading or occupying force in that context. And that's what I said. I said, hey, as far as I understand, it's native land, and I don't see why you have any jurisdiction here. And the judge understood that, which is interesting. He said, oh, yeah, I get it. And everyone else understood it. And it seemed like after that, people came up and shook my hand. They said, we're really glad that you made that statement. And when you reflect back on it, we're talking about a community or people that have faced, hundreds of years of repression and hundreds of years of trying to carve out a little space. And for someone else who comes from a very privileged background to stand there in the courtroom and say, hey, I stand with you guys and I recognize your territory, even if that means that the gavel falls and next day you're sitting in jail, So those are things like the battle over that land and over that territory continues, and it's not going to be won in those courtrooms. But the fact that you can bring the interesting conversations back in any chance you get is something that I think is kind of further struggles and deepens not only the relationships of the people involved in that struggle, but also kind of sort of broadens a little bit of the spectrum in which these conversations, or where these conversations take place, like in the middle of Canada's courts, when they're trying to talk about who's getting charged and with what charge and how much time you're sitting on. Instead, you kind of throw in there that it's like, well, should you be charging people at all, in that context? Anyway, that's kind of my story. I think I'll leave more room for other people to talk. I don't know if that was 10 minutes, 5 minutes, or 2 minutes, but hopefully it kind of sits with you guys all right, and thanks for having me.
When I was thinking about it, what I really realized was whatever point that I came in to participate in what I was participating in, it was through, what brought all the people together to pull it off was through various communities, and communities that overlapped with each other and stuff a lot. And I'm trying to think where I want to start in it, sorry. Okay, I'm going to sort of start in the middle. So, through a good number of my years of my life within the local communities I had in the area of Indigenous people, and some of our communities were bigger, broader circles, a lot of the things that involved in like large acts of resistance were things that we did on smaller scales in like our everyday lives, because there was often somebody getting arrested, and even if it wasn't political, well, it all is, but you know, and or people's kids being taken, and we just come together and do something about it. Sometimes, you know, a lot of times if someone's arrested, then it was pulling together supports for them and their family, and what they were going to need, and sometimes it was stronger and sometimes it wasn't as good as it could have been. And we'd go and we'd be down there in the court, you know, and that would be over any kinds of charges, and we'd be down there if those were people who wanted to see, you know, good wall of community standing, or one person would be there if, you know, it was the sort of person that just didn't want to be alone but didn't want everyone there. And people would think about the family and, you know, bring extra food donations that were brought in for them. And then, like when Bob Lovelace and Paula Sherman were arrested over the uranium mine, the community was just doing the same thing, but like on a bigger scale. And I think the community was able to do that because those were things that we did all the time anyway. And like, there was times where, you know, someone in the community was going to be losing their kids to CAS, and we had the time to like pull together and put up a wall and do whatever creative efforts we could to help them keep them. And some of them were like great creative efforts, like everyone bringing like their empty boxed foods to like make the pantry look really filled by like putting in all the boxes, because, you know, instead of just, you know, well, like it's the end of the pay week or whatever, it's like, well, you're expected to have a full pantry all the time, and that's not very real. So everyone would find creative ways to do it. And sometimes it's the community pulling together and making sure that the kids stayed with other Indigenous families in the community. And I think the skills existed for us to do that because we were constantly on it anyway, and making sure that someone always had an advocate if they had to deal with CS, or if you had to go to the hospital, because you're probably not going to have a really good trip. And so I think it's all those small things that really helped it come off on a big scale when it really had to. And sometimes resisting repression was about just keeping authorities out of our circles as best as we could. And so sometimes that meant barging into, like, you know, a woman in the community's home to make sure things weren't getting out of hand and to just stop whatever was. And it might not even live up to some people's ethics, but you barged in no matter what, whether you're wanted or not, to make sure someone was safe. Or, you know, sometimes, you know, people got beaten up because they didn't know how to respect their family members. And sometimes they were just sort of shunned out of the community until they moved away. And sometimes, one time my niece really was just done with like foster home after foster home. And so like we hid her in the community for several days, like from one house to another, and raised the money very secretly and shipped her out of the province. And she didn't have that much longer to go till she turned 18, and like it gave her a second chance. And I think to really make sure that the bigger things go down successfully, you need to have communities that are overlapping circles of people that know how to do all those things anyway.
Hello, for people that don't know me, I'm Dan Green. I'm from Tananaga Mohawk Territory. And in Tananaga, we've been fighting oppression and repression for 500 years. But recently, since 2001, we fought jurisdiction of the Ontario provincial law in our territory, and in 2001 we kicked out the OPP, and they haven't returned. So I think it's very different on Indian land to be able to fight oppression compared to inner city. Because we can make that stance that they have no jurisdiction, because they truly don't. When we go into courts now, the first time I was arrested, I hired a lawyer and it cost me like $25,000. And I got the same thing as when I didn't hire a lawyer and didn't plea and said, find me how you're going to find me. I got the same sentencing. So I just want to say that, when we fight for legal fees, you're playing into the system. That's what they want you to do. They want you to fundraise for legal fees. They want you to do all that because the lawyer gets paid, the Crown gets paid, the judge gets paid, the province gets paid, the commissioner of the OPP gets paid, the cops get paid for being there. Everybody gets paid except for the one fighting. So I think that, we have to take things differently, and we have to look at the way we fight the oppression differently. And I know what prison is, and I know what fighting oppression is. Currently, I owe CN $650 million. I think I'm up to now. I've been sued by CN 6 times, and that CN police come to my house and serve me papers or try to serve me, and they bring an OPP with them and the Tynaga police with them. They pull in my driveway and they go to serve me. And I said to our cop, I said, "What are you working for the corporation?" To our own police, and he goes, "Well," he says, "I'm here to keep the peace." I said, "If you're here to keep the peace, get that shit out of my yard." And they got in their car and they left, and they couldn't serve me. They found me guilty. I didn't go to court. My buddy calls me and he's sitting in the waiting room for court, and he goes, "What are you doing?" I says, "Well, I'm working." And he phones up Sean, my other friend. He goes, "What are you doing?" And Sean says, "Well, I'm out on the golf course." We were all served. There was 15 of us served, and he says, "Well, what the hell am I doing here?" And he hangs up and he leaves. They haven't come after my house. They haven't come after my cars. They haven't garnished my wages. And so be it. If I have to, I'll go stand on those tracks tomorrow.
You're listening to From Embers, a regular podcast about anarchist and anti-authoritarian ideas and practice throughout so-called Canada. Check us out at fromembers.libsyn.com. In this second part of the show, I chat with Mandy Hiscox about being a part of the G20 main conspiracy group, infiltration, and movement defense. Some backstory about the G20. This was a large meeting of international leaders to discuss the global economy and how to keep the wheels of capitalism turning smoothly after the recession. It was held in downtown Toronto, and the security budget was astronomical, approximately $1 billion. Large protests took place in the days leading up to the summit, as well as during the G20 itself, some of which included property destruction in the financial district in downtown Toronto. In the wake of the G20, police were widely criticized for their brutality against demonstrators, mass arrest tactics, and conditions inside the temporary detention center. Notably, 18 undercover cops infiltrated more than a dozen different groups for almost 2 years prior to the G20. The primary targets of this infiltration were anarchists, Indigenous solidarity organizers, and migrant justice organizers. The work of 2 undercover police officers in particular led to 20 people being charged with conspiracy, a notoriously flimsy charge intended to disrupt political organizing and networks, create fear, and impose collective punishment on anarchists and others engaged in social struggles against capitalism, colonialism, and borders. Restrictive bail conditions, including no participation in public demonstrations of any kind, and non-association with people known to be a member of groups organizing for the G20 mobilizations, were especially disruptive. Thanks for being here, Mandy.
You're welcome. Thanks for the interview.
You're quite welcome. First off, did you want to tell me a little bit about your experience with the G20 and being charged with conspiracy?
Sure. So it was a lot. It was over a large amount of time, and a lot of things happened, and it was like a pretty intense experience. Basically, we had been infiltrated for quite some time, like a year and a half in the lead up to the G20, but we didn't know this, and so a bunch of us were arrested. I was arrested on the night before the big demonstrations, like the big actions, which was June 26th. So I was arrested in the middle of the night before, along with some other people. And as of that point, we slowly learned about the infiltration and about all the evidence that had been being gathered against us. And so it was quite a lot to take in. We also spent quite a lot of time in jail. So I spent a month in jail before I was given bail, and then spent a bunch of time on house arrest, and then a bunch more time under like less severe conditions, and then a bunch of time in jail. So it was a lot of different things happened. Generally speaking, though, I came out relatively unscathed. I think that was different for some people, but my experience was sort of that I learned a lot of really valuable things, and my life wasn't impacted too badly.
I guess what were some of those things that you learned, or how did that experience sort of inform your understanding of repression and how it works and how our communities can deal with that?
Well, I guess one thing that I learned, I think that was really important, is how much support came from the community. And that's also the thing that has maybe more than anything made me think a lot harder about the kind of actions that I do. You know, like a lot of people think that if they get like harsh punishments, or if there's like a long trial, that will kind of put a chill on organizing for people, and that's the thing that will stop people from, ever committing political crimes again. But for me, it's actually really been more like just knowing how much time and energy and resources came to us from the community that probably could have been going somewhere else. So that's not to say that I, don't organize anymore, or that I wouldn't do the kind of action that could land me in jail again, but definitely that's what I think about when I sort of assess what kind of actions I'm going to take part in, which is interesting because that's not what I expected would happen. I kind of came out of jail and I was like, I'm like more committed, and I can do jail now. It wasn't so terrible, and this is a thing that organizers can do. And then I sort of had to reflect on how much the community had to give to us, So that was sort of like the main lesson that I learned. I also think that I learned a lot about conspiracy charges specifically, because I've had a lot of experience in the courts. I've been arrested a lot of times under different circumstances, like from, nonviolent civil disobedience, where everything is really orderly and the court process is really polite and, by the book, through to like a big trial around a squat that we actually did alone without lawyers. So like I'm very familiar with the courts. And this conspiracy stuff, though, was just like a step up, like it was over and above. It felt a lot more stifling, was a lot more difficult to navigate, and the sort of difficulty in dealing with the defense, or like how we were going to navigate the legal system, was huge. So the conspiracy charges themselves like made a huge difference in how we were able to deal with the arrests.
Right. I'd like to hear a little more about that. What kinds of things maybe would you have done differently, or what were some of the specifics of those charges that changed the way that you navigated that?
I don't think I would have done anything differently. I'm actually like really proud of how we dealt with it. I think those circumstances just were that, we didn't have a lot of options. But in terms of the things about conspiracy that make things kind of different, there's a few like legal things, and that is that usually when you get arrested in a group of people, which has happened to me a lot of times, you can have the same lawyer. So, you can all get together, have a meeting, talk to your lawyer, see what you want to do. With conspiracy, though, there's kind of this idea amongst the lawyers that they're, that's normal for them, or that they're trained to think that co-conspirators are going to want to get off easier than others in the group, so that we would actually be in conflict with each other, that we would be pitted against each other. And so for conspiracy, I don't know if this is like mandatory or if it's just what was mandatory for the lawyers. You have to all have your own lawyer. And so for us, what that meant is that we had, one individual accused with one lawyer. The accused were not allowed to talk to each other because we had non-association conditions. We could only talk to each other in the presence of a lawyer. The lawyers were not all on the same page about how much they wanted us to be working together versus how much they wanted to get their client the best possible deal, or not deal, but have them come out in the best possible way. Because that's what lawyers have to do, right? They have to do the very best thing for their own client. And so it was really, really difficult to say to the lawyers, we're not a group, like a bunch of the people who were accused didn't all know each other at first, but we still want to be in solidarity with each other. We want to come to the best decision that's best for everyone in the group, and we want to do it together. And some of the lawyers had a really, really hard time with that. And so it made it really complicated. So partially because of the non-association, partially because of the resistance with some of the lawyers to having us all meet together, to having their clients have access to the disclosure. It just was really complicated, and that's never happened to me before. And so in that kind of situation, we had a really hard time planning and talking. And there's also this other thing with conspiracy where you can have, I don't fully understand it because it's really weird, but you can have this thing called an unindicted co-conspirator. So within the law, there can be people out there who haven't been charged, but when it comes to the arguments or to the evidence, you can be an unindicted co-conspirator. So a person unknowingly can actually be in some weird way a part of the trial. And so what that meant was, and the other thing is, that's strange in the legal system, is that things that you say afterwards can be used as evidence against you in conspiracy. So they can be used to further the Crown's case against you if you say political things, if you make a statement to the press and stuff like that. And so we were never able to meet to be like, what are we and aren't we comfortable with people saying? Because something that I say is going to also, because we're all in a conspiracy trial together, it's going to reflect on every single one of the other people. But I was never in a position to ask those people, like, what would you be comfortable saying? Because I don't want to say something that you wouldn't be comfortable saying because it's going to be attributed to you. Right. So there's that. And on top of that, that's also the case for unindicted co-conspirators. So if somebody randomly who doesn't know that they're being considered in this way says something to the media, it can also reflect on the accused. And so all this meant that, like, we were really, really stifled because nobody wanted to get anyone else in any situation that they weren't prepared for. So, it was just like so weird. And our ability to communicate with each other and our ability to communicate with the media, it was just, and with the, like generally with our movements and people in our communities was just like really, really hard.
Hearing about this makes me realize how well designed, in a sense, conspiracy charges are as a tool for the state to suppress movements, basically, or to, prevent people from speaking publicly or coming together because of sort of raising the stakes of doing that.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, I read a few articles in the lead up because I was super excited to have a trial because I'm like a nerd and I really enjoy trials and I enjoy doing them myself. Like I like not to have a lawyer, so I like the research. It's like super geeky. So I still had hopes at one point that we would be able to have, first of all, have a trial, which we never did get, and secondly, potentially be able to defend myself. And that was really naive because people were just like, no, you need a lawyer. Understandably, people didn't trust like a random person to do anything that might reflect on them, so that makes sense. But I still had these ideas that I'd be doing a lot of research and contributing a lot to the case. So I read a bunch of articles, and that is the general consensus in people that are writing about the political uses of conspiracy, is that it is a perfect tool to use to suppress dissent because it makes people afraid that they are going to be able to be blamed for something that they didn't do, or potentially that they wouldn't condone. And also, it sort of creates leaders, or it creates leaders in a space where we generally don't have them, that it's much easier for the state to look at something that is a large number of people working together and be well, there's no way they could have done that on their own. They're just normal, polite, happy people, except that those people riled them up, the conspirators. And so that's a really useful thing for the state to be able to say. And then also just that if you don't really have anything you can charge someone with,
right,
it's a very convenient catch-all. And so, most of the time people don't get convicted of conspiracy because it's actually quite a difficult thing to convict people of, but it's a way that you can be charged with something, and it's a way that you can inflate the fear and the threat and the way that the media will portray it into something that it's really not. So in reading all of these sort of legal, political articles, that is generally how people feel about these charges, that they're not sort of a legal thing, they're more of a political thing.
Mm-hmm. Certainly, and also I guess that being dragged through the whole court process and dealing with the charges is in and of itself a burden.
It is, but it's a burden no matter what the charge is.
For sure.
Right? I feel like the thing that's weird about conspiracy is all the other stuff that comes with it that doesn't come with a normal charge. Because if you can be shown to have had any part in something, so for example, a bunch of the stuff at the G20 that the state wasn't happy about was the property damage, right, and the black bloc and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. And so if you can't charge people with those things, but you can find people who were in some meetings or, who endorsed something in an article or something like that, then at least you have people that you've charged, and then people are happy.
Right. Here's some info about ongoing repression in southern Ontario. In the early morning hours of Friday, April 6th, police raided a home associated with some of those involved with organizing the Hamilton Anarchist Book Fair in the Tower. The door was kicked in, a flash grenade was thrown into the house, and a full SWAT team entered with assault rifles drawn. 3 people were detained, and 1 person was arrested. Cedar, our cherished friend, a solid comrade, and well-known local anarchist organizer, was arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit an indictable offense, unlawful assembly while masked, in relation to the so-called Lock Street riot. Conspiracy charges are notoriously ambiguous and have a long legacy of being used as a tool of political repression, as we have seen recently with the case of the J20 defendants, who were arrested for resisting Trump's inauguration last January. After several days of stall tactics from the Crown, Cedar appeared in court on Tuesday, April 10th for a bail hearing. Much to our dismay and the shock of every lawyer we've spoken to, Cedar was denied bail. While we do not use this term lightly, the court proceedings can only be described as a political witch hunt. In the end, Cedar was, in part, denied bail because of their self-affirmed and proud anarchist politics. This will likely be a long and costly legal battle, and we're going to need help to fundraise in order to cover all of the associated costs. We love Cedar, and can't stand the idea of him remaining locked in a cage. Whatever amount you can spare, however big or small, would be greatly appreciated. And a brief update about Cedar's case. Cedar is no longer physically in the hands of the state. Unfortunately, Cedar will have to abide by the bail conditions set at the bail appeal for the foreseeable future, including staying out of Hamilton, not participating in any rallies or demonstrations, and being under house arrest. The fight is far from over. Even though Cedar is no longer in jail, they will be facing an unknown amount of time under these conditions while awaiting trial, meaning they will still need our unwavering support. If you'd like to donate, you can go to fundraising.the-tower.ca, and for more updates on Cedar's case, visit hamiltonanarchistsupport.noblogs.org. Do you have thoughts about ways we can organize that inner movements that would make us less vulnerable to this particular kind of repression, or ways that we can resist being suppressed by conspiracy charges, I guess?
Yeah, I think about this a lot, and I don't have an answer, sorry. But the things that I think about are mainly like this tension that exists between being so secure and protected that our movements just remain so small because we don't trust anyone and we don't let anyone in, or we make our tech security so inaccessible that people don't understand it and can't be involved. And then on the other end, just being like, we have nothing to hide, and being wide open, and everyone come, everyone participate, and then you're vulnerable to infiltration, not just of a few people, but of everybody. So I feel like, somewhere in there's a happy medium, and I don't know where it is. And I know in the anarchist community, there's a lot of really different views on how we should be approaching this. I've been excluded, not on purpose, but have ended up being excluded from organizing because of these really silly things. I don't actually understand the program that I need to install on my computer to be able to do the kind of email that is encrypted that people want to do, or my computer is too outdated to run the program that I need to install. And I'm not a super techie person, but there's definitely people who are less techie than I am. So if I can't figure this stuff out, that's a lot of people that can't figure it out,
For sure.
And so on the one hand, I'm like, well, yeah, your small group seems to be as secure as you can possibly be, but there's a lot of people who could contribute a lot who aren't going to be able to. So my sort of what I have come to think, which is not what a lot of people think, is that we just need to know that people are going to be infiltrated and people are going to be arrested and potentially people are going to be jailed, and we need to, plan for that and know that it can happen and be ready to support those folks when it does happen, but it shouldn't ever get to the point where our own security culture makes us less effective or reduces what we're able to do. If we have 100 groups of people doing sketchy activity and 5 of them get infiltrated and 5 of their people, or 5 groups of people have to go through a process and potentially get incarcerated, you still have, 95 groups of people doing stuff. So that's kind of how I feel, and it's not, I don't think it's how a lot of people feel, but I just don't think we will ever be a step ahead of the cops, especially on tech stuff. I don't think we'll ever be able to match their capacity to spy on us, and I don't ever want to be that person who is like, oh, you seem like you don't belong here. I don't know where you came from. I don't trust you at all. You can't come to any meetings,
I mean, I think you're touching on something really important, or that I think is important, which is that security to me is more than a set of tech practices or a sort of, arms race with the state over encryption technology or software or things like that. Because it's true, I don't think these threats to our movements are going to disappear, and we are somehow going to have to find ways to struggle anyway. And finding other ways to do that while also trying to keep ourselves safe and also trying to be open. And it's a challenge for sure.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge. I mean, I read a really great book. Oh my gosh, I can't remember the title. I'm so sorry. But it was just talking a lot about this kind of stuff, and a sort of obvious and traditionally employed method is to keep above ground activities and underground activities completely separate. But I mean, to me, I think about what that would mean, and it would basically mean that if you are somebody who has chosen to do underground activity or organizing that you feel will be looked really badly upon by the state and could result in pretty severe repression, if that's sort of the tactics that you've chosen to employ, that means you can never, ever, ever do anything else. And in our organizing, in the context right now that we're in, that seems just unrealistic, because you would be mostly doing nothing. So I don't know that sort of, I think it's a great system, and it's very secure to have no crossover at all between those two populations, but I just don't know that it's applicable right now, where we're so low in numbers, and there's just so much apathy, and I'm just not sure that that's feasible.
Yeah.
You'd also have to know from a really early age where you wanted to go, because the thing with infiltration is that they're watching you way before you probably even know that you're a useful person for them to watch. So
I feel like assuming that we have the agency over determining what the context is going to be that we're acting in, or what activities the state is going to decide to criminalize or not criminalize in the future is hard. To me, those things seem kind of uncertain.
Absolutely. I mean, even just recently, it's not like criminalization so much, but like in Hamilton just recently, the city council decided that an anarchy symbol is like a hate symbol. And it's like, I mean, to me, I'm just kind of like, haha, that's ridiculous. Like, don't give that any attention. It doesn't deserve any. But then other people are like, wow, this is like a really terrible situation that could slide into something a lot more repressive, right? Because of sort of the time that we're in and the rise of the right and all this stuff. So, yeah, you don't know. You don't know what's going to become illegal / criminal. The other thing that I think people maybe don't know so much about infiltration, or at least I didn't, is what they think is important for them to know, right? So there's this idea in a lot of maybe more mainstream circles that if you have nothing to hide, you shouldn't be hiding anything, right? So like this idea that if you're not doing anything illegal, you have nothing to hide and all that stuff, and so you should be wide open. If cops come, that's fine because you're not doing anything wrong. Like this is like a pretty common idea. But what we found looking through the like thousands of pages of disclosure of police notes and stuff is that most of the time they're not writing down anything to do with anything illegal. They're writing down, you know, who's friends with who, whose relationship is tense with who's disenchanted with the meetings or the organizing, you know, where the tensions are, where the breaks are in the community, and, you know, like basically like who can they tap later for information. And these like social maps that they're making are really what they're looking for. So that's something that they can get from any type of organizing. And, you know, a lot of the thing too with you know, the infiltration is that one of the goals is not really to get convictions. That's not their main goal. One of the goals is just to disrupt. So any kind of organizing that they think is going to be a threat, whether it's like, you know, nonviolent civil disobedience or just like mass marches, anything that they think is going to be a threat, they can just disrupt it, right? And they can do that with the infiltration tactics that they use for any group. And so I think this idea that like you won't be infiltrated if you're not doing sketchy things is like really, really dangerous. And it puts a lot of people in danger as well.
Yeah, for sure. Just in closing, I guess, I know people in the anarchist community often talk about repression as an opportunity to come out stronger on the other side, or to build our skills and capacity for taking care of each other and things like that. In your experience, do you think that's been true, or did you experience repression as something that made your community stronger in the end?
That's a really good question. Sadly, I think it didn't. And I thought for a long time that it had. I really thought that, you know, this is a terrible thing that has happened, but we're going to, you know, stick together. We're going to be in solidarity. We're going to do, you know, the best thing we can with these charges. We're not going to throw anyone under the bus. And, you know, in the end, we'll be able to show that, like, we can weather this kind of thing. And it's not as big of a deal as maybe we thought. And I really did believe that all the way until I got out of jail. And then when I moved back to my community, I was like, oh, like, what has happened, you know? And I think that for us, because we were dealing with, like, really intense external things, I think it was different. The fallout was different than people who hadn't been arrested, who had stayed in the community. Like, I was immediately taken out of the community on house arrest in Ottawa, so I didn't have to deal with any of the sort of personal fallout of the fact that we had had two infiltrators organizing with us for, like, the past year and a half, 2 years, and how people felt about that and how betrayed they felt, and people, you know, just the kind of tensions and sadness and rifts that it had caused in the community. A lot of people had moved away. When I came back, it was so different. And so I don't know what it was like in other places. Hopefully not like that. But it was, it was a bit of a shock to me to come back out of jail and see, like, how little organizing was happening. And, things change, obviously. Like, organizing comes and goes in waves. And, it had been a whole year, 2 years, really, almost. So I'm not saying that it was all because of the infiltration or whatever. Like, things just sometimes change. People move a bunch of people all at the same time, and it decimates the organizing, and those things happen. But it did really feel like it wasn't good for my city. I'd still like to think that the fact that we were able to negotiate 17 people under really difficult circumstances, negotiate a deal that saw most people get off, protected one of our group who didn't have status, sent a bunch of us to jail with not too dire consequences. I'd still like to think that that is, like, kind of inspiring or kind of a good example for folks, but I think generally the infiltration wasn't good for us, sadly.
Right.
I don't know. I hope that, like, people in other communities had a better experience, or I hope even that people would say that I'm wrong about here.
I mean, I read the joint statement, I guess, about the plea deal. I actually did find it inspiring, both in its strong kind of sense that this wasn't about finding victory in the courts, and this is about having solidarity with each other and meeting our personal goals, I guess. But I guess it makes sense that the effects of infiltration don't wrap up neatly or don't go away.
Yeah, and there's also that thing where if something is really bad the first time it happens, it may seem terrible, but it does actually make you stronger if it happens the next time. So hopefully there's a bit of that,
Right.
lingering hidden.
Yeah. Did you have anything else you wanted to mention, or any other ideas that came to mind?
Well, I think I'm just kind of thinking back to jail and prison as a tool of state repression. I think I kind of overlooked a really important thing, which is that the one major thing that it does is it takes people out of the community, right? And so in terms of, like, repressing organizing, if a bunch of people are suddenly not around and a bunch of people are suddenly reworking their activities to be more of a support group for those people that are in prison at the expense of other organizing, then I think it is a really big tool for the state. And so I guess the ways that we can counter that are just, like, obviously to never let people on the inside feel disengaged or separated from the community or the work that's happening. I think that's really important. And I think we're actually quite good at that, keeping people in our minds, keeping people in our hearts, and keeping people involved in organizing even while they're doing jail time. And the other thing is just, like, to really recognize that we have to not sort of drop all the other stuff that we're doing once somebody gets incarcerated. Mm-hmm. Because, again, like, that's really just doing the state's job for them, right? If they can incarcerate one person and everyone freaks out and is like, now we all have to do all this fundraising and write all these letters and this is the most important thing, then that's really a detriment to the movement. So I think there's a balance that needs to be struck between keeping those people involved, but also still organizing on the outside.
Absolutely. Well, thanks very much for having a conversation with me, and I hope we'll talk soon.
I'm sure we will. Thank you.
You've been listening to From Embers, a weekly show about anarchist ideas and practice in the territory most recently known as Canada, on CFRC 101.9 FM in Kingston, Ontario. Got questions or feedback about something you heard on the show? Want to tell us about a project you're excited about? Read some revolutionary poetry on the air? Or just get in touch? Email us at fromembers@riseup.net. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.